Carl Jung explained. If they love you, why do they ignore you so often? Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the unconscious or dreams. It was about love itself, and why the people who claim to love us most are the ones who ignore us with surgical precision. In 1918, while analyzing a patient whose marriage was dissolving despite her husband's insistence that he loved her more than life itself, Jung stumbled upon something that would shatter everything we believe about human connection. This patient would arrive at Jung's office week after week, describing the same devastating pattern. Her husband would profess his undying love in grand gestures, expensive gifts, passionate declarations, promises of devotion. Yet when she needed him most, when vulnerability cracked her voice or tears wet her cheeks, he would vanish. Not physically, but emotionally, he would become a ghost in their own home. Jung initially suspected this was simple cruelty or narcissism, but as he dug deeper into case after case, analyzing relationship patterns across hundreds of patients, he discovered something far more disturbing. The husband wasn't ignoring his wife despite loving her. He was ignoring her because he loved her. Jung called this the love-avoidance paradox, a psychological phenomenon where individuals unconsciously ignore, withdraw from, or create distance with those they care about most deeply. The closer we get to someone, the more our unconscious fears of abandonment, engulfment, or loss activate, causing us to create protective distance through subtle neglect, emotional unavailability, or unconscious withdrawal. This discovery horrified Jung because it meant that our capacity to love and our compulsion to withdraw from love were not opposites. They were the same psychological force expressed through different behaviors. Modern attachment research has validated Jung's most troubling insight. Even securely attached individuals can exhibit profound avoidant behaviors when love triggers their deepest vulnerabilities. We don't ignore people we're indifferent to. We ignore people whose potential loss would destroy us. This isn't conscious cruelty. It's the psyche's desperate attempt to protect itself from the existential terror of loving someone so completely that losing them would feel like death itself. Jung's patient broke down during their 7th session when she realized the truth. Her husband's emotional absence wasn't evidence he didn't love her. It was evidence he loved her so much that his unconscious had declared her too dangerous to get close to. If you've ever felt confused by someone who says they love you but treats you like you're invisible, Jung discovered why this happens. And it's not what you think. The answer lies in understanding that human beings have never learned to tolerate the intensity of complete love without unconsciously protecting themselves from its devastating potential consequences. Jung identified what he termed the love-avoidance trap, a psychological paradox where the depth of our love for someone triggers unconscious defense mechanisms that manifest as emotional distance, inattention, or neglect. This creates the cruelest irony in human relationships. The people we love most become the ones we're most likely to ignore, withdraw from, or take for granted, not because we don't care, but because caring so deeply activates our most primitive psychological defenses. The problem occurs because love makes us vulnerable in ways that trigger ancient survival mechanisms. When we love someone completely, we face the terror of abandonment, that they might leave us. We face the fear of engulfment, that we might lose ourselves in them. We face the unconscious belief, often formed in childhood, that anything we love deeply will eventually be taken away. Jung observed this pattern with devastating consistency across his clinical work. A businessman who adored his wife would become mysteriously unavailable whenever she expressed deep emotion. A mother who would die for her children would find herself irritated and distant when they needed comfort most. Partners who described their love as soulmate connection would unconsciously sabotage intimacy through benign neglect, emotional numbness, or creating crises that justified withdrawal. The trap works like this. Love triggers vulnerability. Vulnerability triggers fear. Fear activates protective mechanisms. Protective mechanisms manifest as emotional unavailability, distraction, or unconscious neglect. The person being ignored feels unloved and rejects or pursues. Either response confirms the love-avoidant person's unconscious belief that love is dangerous, creating more distance. What makes this particularly devastating is that both people are trapped in an unconscious dance where love triggers fear. Fear creates distance, and distance prevents the very intimacy both people actually desire. The person being ignored experiences profound confusion. They can sense their partner's love in moments of presence, yet they're starving for consistent emotional nourishment. They begin to question their own perceptions. If they love me, why do I feel so alone? This leads to what Jung called reality fragmentation, the painful split between what someone says they feel and how they actually behave. The love-avoidant person experiences their own hell. They genuinely love their partner, but find themselves mysteriously unable to show up consistently. They may become irritated by their partner's neediness or demands for attention, not realizing they've unconsciously trained their partner to beg for the emotional presence that should flow naturally in love. Jung discovered that this pattern intensifies over time. As the ignored partner adapts to emotional crumbs, the love-avoidant partner's unconscious interprets this as confirmation that distance is safe. As the love-avoidant partner becomes more emotionally unavailable, the ignored partner often develops what Jung called love hunger, a desperate quality of need that further triggers the love-avoidant person's fears of being engulfed or overwhelmed. The tragedy is that both people often genuinely love each other, but love has become associated with danger in the unconscious, creating an automatic system that destroys the very connection both people most desire. Jung noted that many couples spend decades in this trap, both people feeling unloved, despite being in relationships with people who genuinely care about them. The love-avoidant person can't understand why their partner seems so needy when they're doing their best. The ignored partner can't understand how someone who claims to love them can be so consistently emotionally absent. This creates what Jung called the loneliness of mutual love. Two people who adore each other but have unconsciously made love itself too dangerous to fully experience or express. In 1920, Jung began treating Friedrich Weber, a 42-year-old textile merchant whose marriage was dissolving despite what he insisted was his complete devotion to his wife, Maria. Friedrich had sought Jung's help not for his marriage, but for mysterious periods of depression and anxiety that seemed to arise whenever his business was thriving and his home life was peaceful. "I don't understand my wife's complaints," Friedrich told Jung during their first session. "She says I ignore her, but I work 60 hours a week to provide for her comfort. I've never been unfaithful. I don't drink or gamble, yet she claims I'm absent even when I'm sitting right beside her." Jung observed Friedrich carefully during their sessions and noticed something telling. Whenever Friedrich spoke about his deep love for Maria, his body would subtly shift away. His eye contact would break, and his voice would become distant, as if discussing something simultaneously precious and dangerous. Through detailed analysis of Friedrich's daily patterns, Jung discovered a devastating rhythm. The more Maria expressed vulnerability, need, or deep affection, the more Friedrich would unconsciously withdraw into work, become preoccupied with business matters, or find urgent reasons to travel. When Maria shared her deepest feelings, Friedrich would listen politely but become emotionally unavailable for days afterward, often not even realizing he was doing it. Maria had learned through painful experience that expressing her love or needs would result in Friedrich becoming a ghost in their own home. She had stopped sharing her fears, dreams, or desires because each vulnerable revelation seemed to make her husband disappear emotionally. She lived in a state of emotional starvation while married to a man who insisted he would die for her. Jung's breakthrough came when Friedrich described a childhood memory that had seemed unimportant to him. At age 8, Friedrich's beloved mother had died suddenly from tuberculosis. In the weeks before her death, she had become increasingly affectionate and vulnerable with Friedrich, seeming to sense her approaching mortality. She would hold him close and tell him how much she loved him, how proud she was of him, how he was her greatest treasure. Friedrich remembered feeling overwhelmed by these moments of intense love and connection. Then she was gone. His 8-year-old mind had made an unconscious association. Intense love and vulnerability preceded devastating loss. Deep emotional connection meant impending abandonment. His psyche had learned that when someone you love shows you their deepest heart, death follows. Jung helped Friedrich recognize that his pattern with Maria was a protective mechanism developed by a terrified child. Whenever Maria became vulnerable or expressed deep love, Friedrich's unconscious alarm system would activate, screaming, "Danger! This intimacy means loss is coming. Protect yourself." Friedrich's withdrawal wasn't conscious rejection of Maria. It was unconscious protection against the unbearable pain his child self had experienced when deep love was followed by devastating abandonment. "My love for Maria is genuine," Friedrich realized with tears during their 12th session. "But my unconscious has decided she's too precious to get too close to. It's trying to save me from the agony I felt when my mother died." Jung worked with Friedrich to understand that his emotional withdrawal was actually a measure of how much he loved Maria. His psyche was employing the same protective strategy that had helped him survive his mother's death. "If you don't get too close, the loss won't destroy you." Friedrich began recognizing the internal sensations that preceded his withdrawal. A subtle panic in his chest when Maria looked at him with deep love, an urge to check his work correspondence when she shared something vulnerable, a mysterious irritation when she needed comfort or reassurance. Through months of patient work, Friedrich learned to stay present with these sensations rather than automatically acting out through emotional unavailability. He practiced sharing his internal experience with Maria. "I'm feeling scared by how much I love you right now, and my instinct is to withdraw, but I'm choosing to stay with you instead." Maria, understanding that Friedrich's withdrawal had been protective rather than rejecting, was able to support his efforts to stay present rather than personalizing his avoidance as evidence she wasn't loved. Friedrich's transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, but gradually he developed the capacity to love Maria fully while acknowledging his terror about potential loss, rather than unconsciously protecting himself from loss by creating an emotional distance. Years later, Friedrich would tell Jung, "I finally understand that loving someone completely means staying present with the fear of losing them, rather than avoiding that fear by making them disappear emotionally. My withdrawal wasn't protecting our love, it was slowly killing it." Contemporary psychology and neuroscience research has provided remarkable validation for Jung's insights about love-triggered avoidance patterns, revealing the neurobiological mechanisms that drive these seemingly contradictory behaviors. Dr. Sue Johnson's groundbreaking research on emotionally focused therapy has documented what she calls the protest-withdraw cycle, a pattern where one partner's bid for connection triggers the other partner's defensive withdrawal. Johnson's studies reveal that this cycle often occurs precisely because the relationship matters so much to both people, with the withdrawing partner unconsciously protecting themselves from the vulnerability that deep love requires. Johnson's research shows that love-avoidant behaviors aren't evidence of lack of caring, but often indicate the opposite. The relationship has become so important that the threat of losing it triggers primitive survival responses that manifest as emotional unavailability. Attachment research by Dr. Philip Shaver and Dr. Cindy Hazen demonstrates that even individuals with secure attachment styles can exhibit profound avoidant behaviors when relationships trigger their attachment system's alarm bells about potential loss or engulfment. Their longitudinal studies reveal that relationship satisfaction often decreases not when couples stop caring about each other, but when they care so much that love itself becomes frightening. Revolutionary neuroimaging studies by Dr. Helen Fisher have revealed the neurobiological basis for Jung's observations. When individuals view photos of someone they're deeply in love with, brain scans show simultaneous activation of both reward centers and threat detection systems. The same stimulus that triggers intense pleasure and bonding also activates areas of the brain responsible for identifying potential dangers. This neurological contradiction explains why love can feel simultaneously wonderful and terrifying, leading to the approach avoidance conflicts that Jung observed in his patients. The brain literally interprets deep love as both the greatest reward and a significant threat, creating internal conflicts that often manifest as inconsistent behavior toward beloved partners. Dr. Stan Tatkin's research on couple neurobiology has documented how the brain's threat detection system often misinterprets a partner's emotional needs as potential dangers to autonomy or safety. When someone we love deeply expresses vulnerability or need, our nervous system can unconsciously interpret this as a threat to our independence or emotional stability, triggering defensive responses that look like ignoring or emotional unavailability. Tatkin's studies show that these defensive responses occur most frequently in relationships that matter most to the individuals involved. We don't tend to have strong avoidant reactions to people we're indifferent about. The nervous system reserves its most sophisticated protective mechanisms for relationships that could potentially cause the most emotional damage if they ended. Trauma research by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk reveals that individuals with histories of early loss or abandonment often unconsciously recreate distance in their closest relationships as a way of maintaining some sense of control over inevitable separation. Van der Kolk's work demonstrates that the nervous system often chooses the familiar pain of loneliness over the unfamiliar terror of complete intimacy. Dr. John Gottman's decades of relationship research have identified what he calls emotional flooding, a physiological state where individuals become so overwhelmed by their partner's emotional intensity that they automatically shut down or withdraw. Gottman's studies show that this flooding occurs most frequently when individuals are deeply attached to their partners, suggesting that love itself can become overwhelming to nervous systems that haven't learned to tolerate intense positive emotions. Research on emotional regulation by Dr. Marcia Linehan reveals that many people have never developed the capacity to tolerate the intensity of deep love and connection. Linehan's work shows that withdrawal from intimacy often represents an attempt at emotional regulation rather than rejection of the other person. These findings collectively validate Jung's core insight. Love-avoidant behaviors often occur not despite deep caring, but because of it. The nervous system, designed to protect us from threats, can interpret the vulnerability required for complete love as a danger that must be defended against through distance and emotional unavailability. Through his extensive clinical work, Jung identified 5 distinct patterns of love-triggered avoidance, each representing different unconscious fears about intimacy and connection. Understanding these types can help you recognize your own patterns or those of someone you love. The phantom lover is physically present but emotionally absent, going through the motions of relationship while keeping their heart safely protected behind walls of distraction, work obsession, or emotional numbness. They show up to dinners but scroll their phones. They attend family gatherings but remain mentally elsewhere. They have sex, but their spirit feels vacant. Jung observed that phantom lovers often triggered by a deep fear that real intimacy will lead to loss of identity or autonomy. They unconsciously believe that loving someone completely means disappearing as an individual, so they protect their sense of self through emotional unavailability. They can appear selfish or indifferent, but Jung discovered they're usually terrified of being consumed by love. Maria, Friedrich's wife, described living with a phantom lover. It's like being married to a beautiful statue. He's there, but he's not there. I can see him and touch him, but I can't reach him. It's the loneliest feeling in the world, being ignored by someone who's sitting right beside you. The crisis creator unconsciously generates conflicts, drama, or emergencies whenever the relationship becomes too close or comfortable. They pick fights after intimate conversations. They create problems that require their attention when their partner needs comfort. They manufacture distance through chaos rather than direct withdrawal. These individuals use manufactured crises as justification for emotional distance while maintaining the illusion that external circumstances are responsible for the disconnection. Jung found that crisis creators often stem from childhoods where love was associated with drama or where conflict felt safer than vulnerable intimacy. Every time we got close, one of Jung's patients described about her crisis creator husband, he would find something to be angry about. A peaceful Sunday morning would somehow become a fight about finances or his mother or my cooking. I realized he was allergic to happiness. It made him create problems to avoid intimacy. The intermittent reinforcer provides unpredictable bursts of attention and affection, followed by periods of withdrawal or neglect. They're incredibly present and loving for days or weeks, then become mysteriously unavailable without explanation. This creates an addictive cycle where their partner never knows when love will be available. Jung discovered that intermittent reinforcers, often unconscious beliefs, that consistent love leads to being taken for granted or eventual abandonment. They control intimacy by rationing it, keeping their partners in a state of uncertainty that prevents them from relaxing into secure love. The psychological effect on partners is devastating. Like gamblers at slot machines, they become addicted to the intermittent rewards, constantly hoping for the next period of attention and affection while living in chronic emotional deprivation during the withdrawal periods. The substitute focuser redirects their emotional energy toward children, work, hobbies, or other relationships whenever their primary partnership becomes too intimate. They become obsessed with their career when their spouse wants to connect. They pour all their nurturing energy into their children while their partner feels emotionally starved. They develop intense friendships that seem to replace romantic intimacy. These individuals use legitimate responsibilities as unconscious shields against the vulnerability of complete romantic connection. Jung noted that substitute focusers often fear that romantic love will interfere with their other important relationships or responsibilities, not realizing they're creating the interference through their avoidance patterns. My husband loves our children so much that there's no love left for me, one woman told Jung. He's an incredible father, but I feel like a stranger in my own home. He says the kids need him more than I do, but I think he feels safer loving them because they can't leave him the way I could. The future postponer constantly delays real intimacy by focusing on external goals, conditions that must be met, or future scenarios when they'll really be able to connect. They say they'll be more present after the next promotion, when the house is finished, when the children are older, when retirement comes, when life settles down. Jung found that future postponers use endless preparation as protection against the risk of being fully known and potentially rejected. They keep love theoretical and conditional rather than present and unconditional, always having reasons why now isn't the right time for complete intimacy. The tragic irony is that future postponers often genuinely intend to become fully present someday, not realizing that their pattern of postponement has become their primary way of avoiding the vulnerability that love requires. Their partners live in a state of waiting for a future that never arrives. Jung emphasized that each type represents a different strategy for managing the terror of loving completely while maintaining the illusion of being a loving partner. The person exhibiting these patterns usually has no conscious awareness of their avoidance behaviors and may become defensive or confused when confronted about their emotional unavailability. Understanding these patterns isn't about blame or judgment, it's about recognition. If you see yourself or someone you love in these descriptions, Jung would want you to know that these behaviors represent protection mechanisms developed to manage the overwhelming intensity of deep love, not evidence of lack of caring. Which of these patterns do you recognize in your own relationships? Comment below. Your awareness is the first step toward transformation. Jung warned that unconscious love avoidance patterns create 5 escalating dangers that can destroy both relationships and individual psychological health. These dangers compound over time, creating increasingly severe consequences for everyone involved. Relationship dissolution through emotional starvation represents the most obvious danger, occurring when the ignored partner eventually stops believing in their worth or their partner's love. Jung observed that even the strongest love cannot survive consistent emotional neglect, regardless of the unconscious motivations behind that neglect. The ignored partner typically goes through predictable stages: confusion. If they love me, why do I feel so alone? Self-blame. Maybe I'm too needy or demanding. Anger. I deserve better than this. And finally, emotional detachment. I can't keep trying to reach someone who doesn't want to be reached. Jung documented cases where partners began affairs not out of sexual desire, but out of desperate hunger for emotional presence and attention. Others simply began building separate emotional lives, creating friendships and activities that provided the intimacy missing from their primary relationship. The tragedy is that when relationships end due to love avoidance patterns, both people often feel confused and heartbroken. The love-avoidant person genuinely can't understand why their partner left someone who loved them so much, while the ignored partner feels devastated about leaving someone they still love but could no longer emotionally survive with. Identity loss and self-worth. Destruction develops in the ignored partner who begins questioning their own perceptions, needs, and worth. Jung called this reality fragmentation, the painful psychological split between what someone says they feel and how they actually behave. Partners of love-avoidant individuals often develop what Jung termed love hunger, a desperate quality of need that comes from chronic emotional deprivation. They begin to doubt their own needs for connection, wondering if they're too sensitive or asking for too much. They adapt to receiving crumbs of attention while being told they're deeply loved. This creates profound psychological confusion. The ignored partner can sense their partner's love in moments of presence, yet they're starving for consistent emotional nourishment. They begin to lose trust in their own perceptions and needs, often developing anxiety, depression, or a fragmented sense of self as they try to reconcile the contradiction between loving words and unavailable behavior. Jung observed that some ignored partners develop emotional anorexia. They stop asking for attention or affection because they've learned that expressing needs leads to disappointment or makes their partner withdraw further. They slowly disappear emotionally while remaining physically present in the relationship. Unconscious guilt and self-sabotage emerges in the love-avoidant partner who senses something is wrong but can't understand their own behavior. Jung noted that love-avoidant individuals often experience mysterious depression, anxiety, or unexplained irritability that stems from unconscious guilt about their emotional unavailability. They sense their partner's unhappiness and their role in creating it, but because their avoidance patterns are unconscious, they can't directly address the problem. This creates internal frustration that often manifests as additional relationship sabotage. They may become more emotionally distant, more critical of their partner, or more defensive about their behavior. Jung observed that love-avoidant individuals often punish themselves through workaholism, substance abuse, or other self-destructive behaviors as an unconscious attempt to manage their guilt about being unable to love consistently. They may also provoke their partners into leaving as a way of avoiding the responsibility of ending the relationship themselves. Generational trauma transmission occurs when children witness and internalize these love avoidance patterns, learning that love means inconsistent attention, emotional unavailability, and that their needs for connection are somehow threatening or wrong. Jung was particularly concerned about this danger because children from love-avoidant households often develop one of two adaptive strategies. They become love-avoidant themselves, learning to protect their hearts from disappointment, or they become anxiously attached, desperately trying to earn the consistent love they never received. Children learn that emotional needs make people disappear. They observe that vulnerability leads to abandonment. They internalize the belief that love is dangerous, unpredictable, or conditional on not asking for too much attention or affection. Jung documented cases where these patterns were transmitted across multiple generations, with families developing unspoken rules about emotional expression and connection that prevented anyone from experiencing secure, consistent love. Spiritual and emotional deadening represents the most severe consequence, where both partners gradually lose their capacity for genuine intimacy, joy, and emotional aliveness as they adapt to a relationship structure that provides safety through distance rather than growth through vulnerability. Jung observed that chronic love avoidance creates what he called living death, relationships that survive but don't thrive, where both people exist in emotional isolation while maintaining the appearance of partnership. The ignored partner learns to expect little and ask for less. The love-avoidant partner becomes increasingly numb to their own emotional experience and their partner's needs. Both people slowly lose their capacity for spontaneous affection, emotional vulnerability, and genuine intimacy. They may function well as practical partners, managing households, raising children, maintaining social appearances, but they've sacrificed their aliveness for safety. Jung warned that these relationships become unconscious prisons where both people are slowly dying emotionally while maintaining the illusion of love and commitment. The most tragic aspect is that both people often settle for this diminished version of relationship because it feels safer than risking the vulnerability that authentic love requires. These dangers often worsen over time as both partners unconsciously collude in maintaining emotional safety at the cost of authentic connection and individual growth. Jung emphasized that recognizing these escalating risks is essential for motivating the difficult work of transforming love avoidance patterns into conscious intimacy capacity. Jung developed what he called conscious love integration, a systematic approach to recognizing and transforming love avoidance patterns into authentic intimacy capacity. This process requires courage, commitment, and the willingness to love, despite ongoing fears about vulnerability and potential loss. Fear recognition and mapping forms the foundation of Jung's approach. Most love-avoidant individuals have no conscious awareness of what specifically triggers their withdrawal behaviors. Jung taught his patients to identify their unique intimacy fears: fear of abandonment, being left; fear of engulfment, losing themselves; fear of disappointment, being hurt; or fear of responsibility, being needed too much. The mapping process involves careful observation of internal sensations, thoughts, and impulses that arise just before emotional withdrawal occurs. Friedrich, for example, learned to recognize a subtle panic in his chest whenever Maria looked at him with deep love, followed by an urge to check his business correspondence or remember urgent tasks that required his attention. Jung emphasized that these fears aren't irrational or pathological. They represent the psyche's attempt to protect itself from genuine dangers associated with complete vulnerability. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to recognize it early enough to make conscious choices about how to respond. Vulnerability tolerance. Building teaches individuals to gradually increase their capacity to stay present with intense feelings of love, connection, and emotional exposure without automatically activating protective mechanisms like withdrawal, distraction, or emotional numbing. Jung compared this process to physical conditioning. Just as muscles grow stronger through progressive resistance training, emotional capacity grows through gradually increasing exposure to vulnerability while choosing to remain present rather than protect. This might mean staying emotionally available when your partner is upset, sharing your own needs despite fear of being rejected, or maintaining eye contact during intimate conversations, even when every instinct screams to look away. The practice begins with small steps, staying present for an extra 30 seconds when intimacy feels overwhelming, sharing one vulnerable feeling each day, or resisting the urge to check your phone during emotional conversations. Jung emphasized that progress happens through consistency rather than intensity. Daily practice with manageable levels of vulnerability gradually builds capacity for deeper intimacy. Attachment wound. Healing addresses the original injuries that created love-fear associations in the unconscious. Jung understood that love avoidance patterns usually develop in childhood through experiences of loss, betrayal, abandonment, or emotional overwhelm that taught the psyche to associate deep love with danger. This healing process involves identifying and processing early experiences that created unconscious beliefs, like loving someone completely means they'll leave, being vulnerable leads to being hurt, or emotional needs burden other people. Jung used dream analysis, active imagination, and careful exploration of childhood memories to help patients understand how their current avoidance patterns developed as protective mechanisms. Friedrich's breakthrough came when he connected his withdrawal from Maria to his mother's death, recognizing that his 8-year-old psyche had decided that intense love and vulnerability preceded devastating loss. Understanding this connection allowed Friedrich to differentiate between past trauma and present reality, gradually reducing the automatic activation of his protective withdrawal. Conscious communication protocols develop skills for sharing the internal experience of being triggered by love rather than acting out through ignoring or withdrawal. Jung taught patients to verbalize their internal process. I'm feeling scared by how much I love you right now. My instinct is to withdraw, but I'm choosing to stay with you. Or, I'm feeling overwhelmed by intimacy, but that's about my fear, not about you. This radical transparency serves multiple purposes. It keeps the love-avoidant partner engaged rather than withdrawn. It helps their partner understand that withdrawal isn't personal rejection, and it gradually reduces the shame and secrecy that often surround intimacy fears. Jung emphasized that these communications must be honest rather than manipulative. The goal isn't to use vulnerability as a tool to manage the relationship, but to share authentic internal experience as a way of staying connected even when fear is present. Mindful relationship engagement involves bringing conscious awareness to daily interactions, noticing impulses to withdraw or ignore, and making deliberate choices to stay present and engaged, even when intimacy feels overwhelming or scary. This practice includes simple but powerful behaviors: maintaining eye contact during conversations, putting away devices during time together, asking follow-up questions when your partner shares something important, and offering physical affection even when you feel emotionally guarded. Jung taught his patients to treat presence as a conscious choice, rather than an automatic response to feeling loving. Even when love fear is activated, they could choose engagement over protection, curiosity over withdrawal, and connection over safety. Integration of love and fear represents the most advanced aspect of Jung's approach. Rather than trying to eliminate fear about vulnerability, individuals learn that mature love includes acknowledging the terror of intimacy while choosing connection anyway. Jung taught that the goal isn't fearless love, but courageous love, the ongoing willingness to stay present with someone despite the eternal risks of complete vulnerability. This means accepting that loving someone deeply will always involve some fear about potential loss, disappointment, or hurt, while refusing to let that fear control behavior. Friedrich's final integration came when he could say to Maria, "I'm terrified by how much I need you, and I'm choosing to love you completely anyway. My fear doesn't mean you're dangerous. It means you matter so much that losing you would devastate me. But I'd rather risk that devastation than protect myself through distance." Jung emphasized that this integration is never complete or permanent. The capacity to love consciously requires ongoing practice, regular recommitment, and the humility to recognize when protective patterns are reactivating. But individuals who develop this capacity experience relationships of profound intimacy, growth, and mutual support that seemed impossible when love was unconsciously feared. Jung documented striking differences between individuals who successfully integrated their love-fear conflicts and those who remained trapped in love-avoidance patterns. By studying both historical figures and his patients, Jung identified the crucial factors that determine whether someone transcends their intimacy fears or remains imprisoned by them. Johnny Cash and June Carter exemplified successful integration of love-fear, with both partners openly acknowledging their terror of loving so deeply while choosing to stay engaged through addiction, career pressures, and personal struggles that could have justified withdrawal. Jung would have been fascinated by Cash's famous words, "The first time I saw her, I knew I was in trouble. Not because I didn't love her, but because I loved her too much." Cash's addiction and June's initial marriage to another man created perfect justifications for love avoidance, but both partners chose vulnerability over protection. Their relationship survived because they developed what Jung called transparent intimacy, the ability to share their fears about loving deeply rather than acting those fears out through withdrawal. June could tell Johnny, "Your love scares me because I can't imagine surviving if I lose you," while Johnny could admit, "Sometimes I use drugs because being loved this much feels too intense to handle." Their love letters reveal the ongoing courage required for conscious love integration, acknowledging terror while choosing presence, accepting vulnerability as the price of authentic connection, and refusing to use fear as justification for emotional unavailability. F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald represented the tragic failure pattern, where genuine love was sabotaged by unconscious fear patterns that manifested as affairs, alcoholism, and emotional unavailability that destroyed both their relationship and their individual well-being. Scott loved Zelda desperately, but his love triggered profound fears about losing his creative identity and masculine autonomy. Rather than recognizing and sharing these fears, he acted them out through drinking, affairs, and periods of cruel emotional withdrawal that coincided with their most intimate moments. Zelda's mental health struggles were partly a response to Scott's love-avoidance patterns. She experienced the devastating confusion of being deeply loved and simultaneously ignored, leading to the reality fragmentation that Jung identified as a common consequence of love-avoidance relationships. Their tragedy illustrates Jung's warning that unconscious love fear often destroys what it's trying to protect. Scott's attempts to maintain safety through distance ultimately led to losing Zelda entirely, confirming his worst fears about love leading to abandonment. Pierre and Marie Curie demonstrated mature love integration, maintaining deep emotional connection and mutual support, while navigating the vulnerabilities of shared ambition, scientific collaboration, and the constant risk of loss that comes with loving someone whose work involves physical danger. Jung would have admired their ability to love completely while acknowledging the genuine risks involved. Marie's work with radioactive materials posed real threats to her health and longevity, creating legitimate reasons for Pierre to protect himself emotionally. Instead, he chose deeper presence, supporting her dangerous research while staying emotionally available despite his fears about potential loss. Their correspondence reveals the conscious choice to love despite vulnerability. Our conversation very soon became friendly. It seemed to me that I had found a brother, someone who understood my preoccupations and could guide me. They chose professional and personal intimacy simultaneously, refusing to sacrifice one for the safety of the other. Ernest Hemingway's relationships showed the destructive pattern of love avoidance, where his genuine capacity for deep feeling was consistently sabotaged by unconscious withdrawal, emotional unavailability, and the creation of distance through alcohol and other relationships whenever intimacy became too real. Hemingway's 4 marriages followed similar patterns: intense initial connection followed by gradual emotional withdrawal, as intimacy triggered his fears of vulnerability and dependence. He would create distance through work obsession, drinking, affairs, or picking fights that justified separation from partners he actually loved deeply. His writing reveals the internal experience of love avoidance, the simultaneous longing for and fear of deep connection, the use of adventure and alcohol to manage intimacy anxiety, and the tragic pattern of losing what he most desired through his attempts to protect himself from it. Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt illustrated complex but ultimately successful love integration, where both partners learned to navigate their fears of vulnerability and loss while maintaining deep connection despite challenges that could have justified emotional withdrawal. Their relationship faced extraordinary tests: Franklin's polio, his affair with Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's struggles with self-worth, and the pressures of political life that provided countless justifications for emotional distance. Yet both partners chose ongoing engagement over protective withdrawal. Eleanor's transformation from an insecure young woman to a confident partner and public figure occurred partly through her conscious choice to love Franklin despite her fears of abandonment and inadequacy. Rather than withdrawing when his affair was discovered, she chose to rebuild intimacy on more honest foundations. Franklin's paralysis could have justified emotional withdrawal from Eleanor and their children, using his physical limitations as protection against vulnerability. Instead, he chose deeper intimacy, relying on Eleanor's emotional support while maintaining his role as her political and personal partner. Jung noted that the difference between relationship success and failure wasn't in the presence or absence of love-fear, but in the conscious recognition of these patterns and the ongoing choice to stay engaged, despite the terror that deep love inevitably triggers. Successful couples learn to share their fears about loving deeply rather than acting them out through distance, while failed relationships were characterized by unconscious protection, taking precedence over conscious connection. Jung's own marriage revealed his intimate struggle with love-avoidance patterns and the journey toward conscious love integration. His personal battle with these dynamics provided the foundation for his theoretical understanding and therapeutic approach, making his insights both deeply authentic and painfully earned. Despite genuinely loving his wife Emma, Jung often withdrew into his work, his inner psychological explorations, or relationships with other women when his marriage became too intimate or when Emma's needs triggered his fears of engulfment or loss of individuality. Jung's letters and journal entries from the early years of his marriage reveal the internal experience of love avoidance, simultaneous adoration for Emma, and terror about losing his independence, deep appreciation for her support combined with resentment when she needed his emotional presence, and confusion about his own inconsistent behavior toward someone he insisted he loved completely. Emma Jung, intelligent and psychologically sophisticated in her own right, experienced the devastating confusion that partners of love-avoidant individuals endure. She could sense Carl's deep love and genuine care, yet she often felt emotionally starved and uncertain about her place in his priorities. She learned to compete with his work, his patience, and his inner world for emotional access to her own husband. Jung's affair with Toni Wolff represented in part an unconscious strategy for managing his terror of complete intimacy with Emma. By spreading his emotional investment across multiple relationships, he protected himself from the vulnerability of complete dependence on one person. If Emma disappointed him, rejected him, or left him, he wouldn't be completely devastated because his emotional needs were distributed across several connections. This pattern illustrates what Jung later called intimacy dilution, the unconscious strategy of maintaining multiple emotional connections to avoid the complete vulnerability that comes with loving one person with your entire heart. Jung rationalized his affair as necessary for his psychological development and Emma's growth, not recognizing initially that it was partly a protective mechanism against the terror of loving his wife completely. During his Red Book period from 1913 to 1930, Jung's psychological crisis was triggered partly by his recognition of his own love avoidance patterns and the guilt he felt about his inability to love Emma with the consistency and presence she deserved. His confrontation with his unconscious revealed how his protective mechanisms were damaging the person he cared about most. Jung's journal entries from this period are agonizing to read. "I love Emma more than my own life, yet I find myself becoming distant whenever she needs me most. I feel like a man dying of thirst who pushes away water because he's afraid of drowning. My protection of myself has become my torture of her." His inner work during this period involved recognizing that his withdrawal wasn't because he didn't love Emma, but because he loved her so much that the thought of losing her, or of disappointing her, felt unbearable. His affair with Tony wasn't evidence of inadequate love for Emma, but of his unconscious attempt to manage the overwhelming intensity of loving her completely. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his pattern with Emma mirrored his relationship with his own mother, who had been emotionally unstable and unpredictable during his childhood. His young Psyche had learned to maintain emotional distance from the women he loved most as protection against their potential abandonment or engulfment. "I have been treating Emma as if she were my mother," Jung wrote in 1917, "protecting myself from her love because my child self learned that a woman's love could disappear without warning or become so overwhelming that I would lose myself entirely." Through his inner work, Jung gradually learned to recognize when his love fear was being triggered with Emma and developed practices for staying present despite his terror. He began sharing his internal experience with her. "I'm feeling scared by how much I need you right now," or "My instinct is to withdraw, but I recognize this is my fear, not a problem with you." Emma's response to Jung's growing transparency about his intimacy fears was initially skeptical. She had been hurt too deeply by his emotional unavailability to immediately trust his explanations. But gradually, as Jung's behavior became more consistent with his words, she was able to support his efforts to stay present, rather than personalizing his withdrawal as evidence she wasn't loved. Jung's integration of his love-avoidance patterns wasn't complete or perfect. He continued to struggle with balancing his needs for independence and solitude with Emma's needs for emotional presence and connection. But he developed the capacity to recognize when he was withdrawing and to make conscious choices about staying engaged rather than automatically protecting himself through distance. Later in their marriage, Jung could tell Emma, "I may always struggle with the intensity of loving you this much, but my struggle doesn't mean you're asking for too much or that our love is wrong. It means you matter so much to me that the thought of losing you triggers my deepest fears. But I'd rather face those fears than lose you through my own protective behaviors." Jung's personal journey with love avoidance became foundational to his understanding of relationship dynamics and the individuation process within partnership. His hard-won insights about the relationship between love and fear, vulnerability and growth, became some of his most valuable contributions to understanding human intimacy. His integration of this shadow aspect of love taught him that mature relationships require ongoing courage rather than the absence of fear, and that the capacity to love deeply develops through choosing vulnerability repeatedly rather than through eliminating the anxiety that comes with complete emotional exposure. Jung developed specific practices for recognizing and transforming love avoidance patterns into conscious intimacy skills. These tools are designed to help individuals stay emotionally present even when love triggers their deepest protective mechanisms. The daily check-in practice forms the foundation of Jung's approach, involving regularly asking yourself specific questions to develop awareness of avoidance triggers and patterns. Each evening, Jung recommended reviewing the day with questions like, "When did I withdraw from or ignore my partner today? What was I feeling just before I became emotionally unavailable? And what did my partner need that I found myself unable to provide?" This practice isn't about self-criticism, but about developing conscious awareness of unconscious patterns. Most love-avoidant individuals have no idea how often they withdraw or what triggers their emotional unavailability. The daily check-in creates a feedback loop that gradually brings unconscious behaviors into conscious awareness. Jung emphasized that this practice should be done with curiosity rather than judgment. The goal is to notice patterns without shame. Interesting. I withdrew when Maria shared her fears about her job. What was I afraid of in that moment? This approach allows individuals to study their own protective mechanisms with the same objectivity they might bring to understanding any other psychological phenomenon. Love-fear. Mapping creates a detailed understanding of your specific intimacy fears and learns to recognize the early warning signs when these fears are being activated before they trigger withdrawal behaviors. Jung taught patients to identify their unique fear signatures. What specific situations trigger your withdrawal? What physical sensations accompany intimacy anxiety? What thoughts or beliefs arise when love feels dangerous? Friedrich discovered that his love fear was triggered by Maria's emotional vulnerability, physical affection when he felt overwhelmed, and conversations about their future together. His early warning signs included a tightness in his chest, thoughts about work that couldn't wait, and an urge to check his correspondence or find reasons to leave the room. The mapping process involves creating a personal intimacy fear inventory. Fear of abandonment. If I love completely, they'll leave. Fear of engulfment. If I get too close, I'll lose myself. Fear of disappointment. If I open my heart, I'll be hurt. Fear of responsibility. If they need me too much, I'll be trapped. Or fear of exposure. If they see me completely, they'll reject me. Understanding your specific fears allows you to recognize when they're being triggered and make conscious choices about how to respond rather than automatically activating protective withdrawal. Presence practice. Under pressure involves deliberately staying emotionally available during moments when you normally would withdraw. Jung called this conscious intimacy conditioning, building your capacity to remain present when love feels overwhelming or scary. This practice begins with identifying your typical withdrawal moments, when your partner is upset, when they express deep feelings, when they need comfort, when they want to talk about the relationship, or when they show physical affection. Instead of automatically withdrawing during these moments, you practice staying present for gradually increasing periods of time. The practice might involve maintaining eye contact during difficult conversations, putting your phone away when your partner needs attention, asking follow-up questions instead of changing the subject, or offering physical comfort when your instinct is to create space. Jung emphasized starting small. Don't try to transform overnight. If you usually withdraw completely when your partner is emotional, practice staying present for just 2 minutes longer than usual. If you typically avoid eye contact during intimate conversations, challenge yourself to maintain connection for 30 seconds at a time. Vulnerable communication skills teaches specific phrases and approaches for sharing your internal experience of being triggered by love, rather than acting out through ignoring or withdrawal. Jung believed that transparency about intimacy fears could transform them from relationship destroyers into opportunities for deeper connection. Essential phrases include, "I'm feeling scared by how much I need you right now. I want to withdraw, but I'm choosing to stay because I love you. My instinct is to ignore you when I feel this vulnerable, but you deserve my presence. And I'm feeling overwhelmed by intimacy, and that's about my fear, not about you." Jung taught that these communications must be genuine rather than manipulative. The goal isn't to use vulnerability as a tool to manage your partner's responses, but to share authentic internal experience as a way of staying connected even when fear is present. Advanced vulnerable. Communication involves sharing the specific nature of your intimacy fears. When you need me emotionally, part of me panics because I'm afraid I'll disappoint you. Your love triggers my fear of losing myself, but I'm learning to stay present anyway. Or, I withdraw when you're vulnerable because it reminds me of my mother, but you're not my mother and you deserve better from me. The repair and reconnect protocol provides specific steps for addressing times when you did withdraw or ignore your partner, turning these failures into opportunities for deeper intimacy rather than sources of shame or distance. The protocol involves 4 steps. Immediate acknowledgement. I realize I withdrew when you needed me. Taking responsibility without excuses. My withdrawal was about my fear, not about anything you did wrong. Sharing the specific trigger. I got scared when you started crying because it reminded me of feeling helpless as a child. And making specific commitments. Next time I feel that fear, I'm going to tell you what's happening instead of disappearing. Jung emphasized that repair must include specific behavioral commitments rather than general promises. Instead of "I'll try to be more present," the commitment should be, "When I feel the urge to check my phone during our conversations, I'm going to put it in another room and ask you a question about what you're sharing." Conscious attention training involves deliberately practicing, giving your partner your full presence for specific periods each day, noticing impulses to multitask, check your phone or mentally withdraw, and choosing engagement over distraction as an act of love. This practice includes simple but powerful behaviors: maintaining eye contact during conversations, asking follow-up questions that show genuine interest, putting away devices during meals together, offering physical affection without expecting anything in return, and creating regular periods of undivided attention. Jung taught that conscious attention is a skill that requires practice rather than something that occurs naturally when you love someone. Even individuals who love deeply often struggle to maintain consistent presence because intimacy can trigger anxiety that manifests as distraction or emotional unavailability. The training begins with brief periods of complete presence, 10 minutes of undivided attention during dinner, 5 minutes of focused listening when your partner shares something important, or 3 minutes of physical affection without thinking about anything else. Jung emphasized that these practices aren't about eliminating the fear that triggers love avoidance, but about choosing love despite the fear, developing what he called courageous intimacy, the ongoing willingness to stay present with someone even when loving them feels overwhelming or dangerous. Jung identified 4 progressive stages individuals pass through when transforming love avoidance patterns into mature intimacy. Capacity. Understanding these stages helps individuals recognize where they are in their journey and what challenges they can expect as they develop the capacity for conscious love. Stage 1. Recognition of the pattern occurs when individuals first realize they have a tendency to withdraw from or ignore people they love most. This recognition is often triggered by a partner's complaint, a relationship crisis, or self-reflection that reveals the gap between their loving intentions and their actual behavior. The initial reaction to this recognition is typically shock and denial. "I'm not ignoring them. I work 60 hours a week to provide for them." Or, "They're being too sensitive. I show love through actions, not constant attention." Jung observed that individuals often resist acknowledging their love avoidance patterns because doing so requires admitting they've been hurting someone they care about. This stage involves developing what Jung called behavioral honesty, the ability to observe your own actions objectively rather than defending or rationalizing them. Recognition requires accepting that good intentions don't excuse harmful impact, and that love can coexist with behaviors that make others feel unloved. The breakthrough moment often comes when individuals realize their partner's complaints about being ignored aren't attacks on their character but accurate descriptions of their actual behavior, regardless of their internal feelings or intentions. Stage 2. Understanding the fear involves discovering what specific aspect of love triggers the avoidance patterns. Jung taught that love avoidance isn't random, but represents the psyche's attempt to protect against specific perceived dangers associated with complete intimacy. This stage requires exploring early experiences of loss, betrayal, abandonment, or emotional overwhelm that taught the unconscious to associate deep love with danger. Individuals often discover connections between their current avoidance patterns and childhood experiences they hadn't previously considered significant. Friedrich's breakthrough came when he connected his withdrawal from Maria to his mother's death, recognizing that his 8-year-old Psyche had decided that intense love and vulnerability preceded devastating loss. This understanding allowed him to differentiate between past trauma and present reality. Common fear discoveries include, I withdraw because I learned that people you love leave without warning. I avoid intimacy because my childhood home was chaotic when emotions were high. I ignore my partner because I was overwhelmed by my mother's emotional needs as a child. Or I create distance because I watched my father lose himself in my mother's demands. Understanding the fear doesn't immediately eliminate the avoidance pattern, but it reduces the shame and self-criticism that often accompany these behaviors. Individuals can begin to see their withdrawal as a protective mechanism developed by a wounded child rather than evidence of their inability to love. Stage 3. Practicing conscious presence represents the most challenging phase of the integration journey. This stage involves learning to stay emotionally available even when love fear is activated, recognizing the internal signals that usually trigger withdrawal, and making deliberate choices to remain engaged despite discomfort or anxiety. This practice feels counterintuitive and often overwhelming initially. Individuals are learning to do the opposite of what their nervous system believes is necessary for survival, staying present with perceived danger rather than protecting themselves through distance. Jung compared this stage to learning to swim. You must do the opposite of what your survival instincts demand. Instead of thrashing to stay above water, you must relax and trust that you can float. Instead of withdrawing when love feels overwhelming, you must stay present and trust that you can survive complete intimacy. The practice involves gradual exposure to increasing levels of intimacy while maintaining presence. This might mean staying in the room when your partner is emotional, maintaining eye contact during vulnerable conversations, or sharing your own needs, despite fear of being rejected or overwhelming your partner. Common challenges during this stage include feeling overwhelmed by your partner's emotions, anxiety about losing your independence, fear that your partner will become too dependent on your presence, worry that you can't sustain this level of availability, and shame about how difficult it is to do what seems like it should be natural. Jung emphasized that progress in this stage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by the increasing willingness to stay present despite fear. Success looks like, I felt terrified when you needed me, but I stayed with you anyway, rather than, I no longer feel scared by intimacy. Stage 4. Integrated intimate capacity emerges when individuals can love deeply while acknowledging their ongoing fears about intimacy. Jung emphasized that this isn't the elimination of love fear, but the development of what he called mature intimacy, the ability to stay present with someone despite the eternal vulnerabilities that come with complete love. Individuals at this stage no longer need to withdraw or ignore when love feels overwhelming, but they haven't eliminated their sensitivity to intimacy anxiety. Instead, they've developed the capacity to feel the fear and choose connection anyway, often sharing their vulnerabilities as part of authentic intimacy with their partner. Friedrich reached this stage when he could tell Maria, I felt that familiar panic when you looked at me with so much love just now. But instead of withdrawing, I want to tell you that your love still overwhelms me sometimes. And that's because you matter so much to me that losing you would feel like losing myself. Integrated intimate capacity includes several key abilities: recognizing love-fear quickly without being controlled by it, sharing intimacy anxieties with your partner rather than acting them out through withdrawal, staying present during your partner's emotional moments without being overwhelmed, offering comfort and support even when you feel anxious about their needs, and maintaining your individual identity while being completely available for intimate connection. Jung emphasized that this integration isn't a permanent achievement, but an ongoing practice that requires daily recommitment. Individuals with integrated intimate capacity still experience love-fear, but they've developed the skills and courage to choose presence over protection consistently. This stage represents what Jung called conscious love, the mature capacity to love someone completely while acknowledging the ongoing risks and vulnerabilities that such love requires, choosing intimacy despite fear rather than waiting for fear to disappear before becoming fully available for love. Jung identified 4 primary pitfalls that can derail the journey from love avoidance to conscious intimacy, each requiring careful navigation to avoid creating new relationship problems while attempting to solve old ones. Overcompensation and love bombing occurs when individuals recognize their avoidance patterns and swing to the opposite extreme, overwhelming their partner with excessive attention, affection, or presence that feels artificial and unsustainable. Jung observed this pattern in patients who, upon recognizing their emotional withdrawal, would suddenly become intensely available, showering their partners with attention, gifts, constant communication, and declarations of love that felt overwhelming rather than nurturing. This overcompensation often stems from guilt about past unavailability, combined with anxiety about losing their partner's love. The problem with love bombing is that it's typically unsustainable. Individuals haven't developed genuine capacity for consistent intimacy. They're simply forcing themselves to behave differently without addressing the underlying fears that created their avoidance patterns. This leads to inevitable burnout and often a return to even more severe withdrawal than before. Partners on the receiving end of love bombing often feel confused and suspicious rather than reassured. They may think, "This doesn't feel real. Where is this coming from? How long will it last?" The artificial intensity can feel more distressing than the previous emotional absence because it lacks the authenticity that genuine intimacy requires. Jung taught that sustainable transformation requires gradual, consistent increases in presence rather than dramatic behavioral reversals. The goal is developing authentic capacity for intimacy, not performing emotional availability to compensate for past failures. Intellectual understanding without emotional integration happens when people can analyze their love avoidance patterns brilliantly but haven't developed the emotional capacity to stay present when fear is activated. This creates a gap between what they know and what they can actually do. Individuals caught in this pitfall can explain their intimacy fears with psychological sophistication. "I withdraw because my attachment style was formed through early abandonment experiences that created associations between vulnerability and danger." But when their partner actually needs emotional support, they still find themselves unable to stay present. Jung noted that intellectual insight alone doesn't change unconscious behavioral patterns. Understanding why you avoid intimacy is valuable but insufficient for developing the capacity to choose presence when love feels overwhelming or scary. This pitfall often manifests as explaining avoidance behaviors rather than changing them. "I know I withdrew when you were upset, but it's because of my childhood trauma," or "My inability to stay present isn't personal, it's just my attachment style." The understanding becomes an excuse for continued emotional unavailability rather than a foundation for growth. Jung emphasized that emotional integration requires experiential learning through gradually increasing exposure to intimacy while choosing to stay present despite discomfort. Intellectual understanding must be combined with behavioral practice to create real change. Blame shifting and victim identity develops when individuals use their newly discovered love fears to excuse continued avoidance, positioning themselves as victims of their own psychology, rather than taking responsibility for choosing different behaviors in the present. This pitfall transforms insights about love avoidance into justifications for continued emotional unavailability. I can't help withdrawing. I was abandoned as a child. My partner should understand that intimacy is triggering for me because of my trauma, or it's not my fault that I ignore them when they're emotional. This is just how my nervous system works. Jung observed that while understanding the origins of avoidance patterns is valuable, using that understanding to avoid responsibility for current choices prevents genuine transformation. Past wounds explain current patterns but don't excuse ongoing harm to loved ones. This pitfall often includes expecting partners to accommodate avoidance behaviors indefinitely. You should know not to get emotional because it triggers my abandonment fear, or if you really understood my attachment issues, you wouldn't expect me to be present when you're upset. Jung taught that healing involves taking responsibility for your current choices regardless of past wounds. Understanding why you avoid intimacy should motivate change, not justify continued patterns that hurt people you love. Performance intimacy occurs when staying present becomes another way to avoid genuine vulnerability, with individuals learning to perform emotional availability while still protecting their hearts from the real risks of complete love and intimacy. This pitfall is particularly subtle because the behavior looks correct from the outside. Individuals appear engaged, present, and emotionally available, but their presence lacks the authenticity and vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. They're going through the motions of connection without risking their hearts. Performance intimacy often includes asking the right questions without being genuinely interested in the answers, offering comfort without feeling genuinely moved by their partner's pain, maintaining eye contact without allowing themselves to be seen, or sharing vulnerabilities that feel safe rather than genuinely exposing. Jung noted that performance intimacy can be more damaging than obvious withdrawal because it creates the illusion of connection while maintaining emotional distance. Partners often sense that something is missing, but can't identify what's wrong because their partner appears to be doing everything right. The challenge is that individuals caught in performance intimacy often don't recognize they're still protecting themselves. They believe they've overcome their avoidance patterns because they're no longer obviously withdrawing, not realizing they've simply found more sophisticated ways to avoid genuine vulnerability. Jung emphasized that authentic intimacy requires ongoing risk-taking and genuine vulnerability rather than perfect intimate behavior. The goal is real connection, not flawless performance of connection. The meta-avoidance trap represents Jung's most sophisticated warning. Some individuals avoid recognizing their love avoidance patterns as another form of protection against vulnerability. They may intellectualize the concept, apply it to other people, or use it to analyze past relationships while remaining blind to their current patterns. Jung warned that the most psychologically sophisticated individuals often develop the most subtle forms of avoidance. They may become experts on attachment theory, relationship dynamics, or intimacy fears while remaining unable to apply these insights to their own current behavior. This meta-avoidance can also manifest as becoming overly focused on their partner's avoidance patterns while remaining blind to their own. I'm not the one with intimacy issues, they're the one who withdraws. Or, I understand love avoidance perfectly, but my partner is the one who needs to work on this. Jung taught that authentic transformation requires ongoing humility and willingness to discover new layers of avoidance patterns rather than assuming you've mastered the challenge of conscious love. The most dangerous assumption is believing you've overcome your intimacy fears when you've simply developed more sophisticated ways of protecting yourself from vulnerability. Friedrich Weber's Complete Transformation illustrates the profound healing possible when love avoidance patterns are brought into conscious awareness and integrated through patient, courageous practice. After 18 months of analysis with Jung, Friedrich had developed the capacity to recognize his withdrawal patterns before they controlled his behavior. The breakthrough came during a session where Friedrich described a moment with Maria that would have previously triggered his automatic emotional retreat. Maria was crying about her sister's illness, Friedrich told Jung. In the past, I would have felt that familiar panic, the sense that her pain was too much for me to handle, that I needed to escape before being overwhelmed. I would have found an excuse to leave the room, checked my correspondence, or suddenly remembered urgent business matters that required my immediate attention. Instead, Friedrich had chosen differently. When he felt the familiar tightness in his chest and the urge to create distance, he recognized these sensations as signals of his love, fear, rather than accurate assessments of danger. I told Maria what was happening inside me, Friedrich continued. I'm feeling scared by how much your pain affects me, and my instinct is to withdraw. But I want to stay with you because you matter more to me than my comfort. It was terrifying to be that honest, but something remarkable happened. Maria's response had been profound relief rather than the rejection or overwhelming neediness that Friedrich had feared. She said she could sense when I was withdrawing and had always assumed it meant she was too much for me to handle. When I explained that my withdrawal was actually a measure of how much I loved her, she felt seen and understood rather than rejected. Friedrich discovered that his transparency about his intimacy fears actually created more connection than his previous attempts to manage those fears through distance. His vulnerability invited Maria's understanding rather than triggering her abandonment anxiety. Over the following months, Friedrich developed what Jung called conscious intimacy skills. When Maria needed emotional support, Friedrich learned to stay present with his own discomfort rather than avoiding hers. When she expressed deep love, he practiced receiving her affection despite the vulnerability it triggered. When she shared her fears or dreams, he engaged with genuine interest rather than finding reasons to redirect the conversation. The paradox Jung helped me understand is that I thought I was protecting our love by maintaining distance, Friedrich reflected. But my protection was slowly killing what I was trying to preserve. The love I was afraid of losing through vulnerability was actually dying from my attempts to keep it safe. Friedrich's marriage not only survived but deepened into a level of intimacy he had never thought possible. Maria, understanding that his previous withdrawal had been protective rather than rejecting, was able to support his ongoing efforts to stay present rather than personalizing his occasional moments of intimacy anxiety. Their relationship became what Jung called a laboratory for conscious love, a space where both partners could acknowledge their fears about vulnerability while choosing connection over protection. When Friedrich felt overwhelmed by Maria's needs, he could share that experience rather than acting it out through withdrawal. When Maria felt insecure about Friedrich's love, she could express those fears directly rather than increasing her emotional demands. We learned that love isn't the absence of fear, Friedrich wrote to Jung years later. Love is choosing each other despite the ongoing terror of potentially losing someone who has become essential to your happiness. My withdrawal wasn't evidence that I didn't love Maria enough. It was evidence that I loved her so much that losing her felt unbearable. Friedrich's transformation extended beyond his marriage. His relationship with his children deepened as he learned to stay present with their emotional needs, rather than delegating their care to Maria when they required comfort or attention. His business relationships improved as he developed the capacity to remain engaged during difficult conversations, rather than withdrawing when conflicts arose. Most remarkably, Friedrich reported that his mysterious periods of depression and anxiety, the symptoms that had originally brought him to Jung, disappeared as he learned to love consciously. Jung understood that Friedrich's depression had been partly the result of unconscious guilt about his inability to show up consistently for the people he cared about most. I finally understand what Jung meant when he said that the cure for depression is often the courage to love completely. Friedrich wrote, "My sadness was the grief of a man who wanted to love but had made love itself too dangerous to fully experience. When I learned to stay present despite my fears, the depression lifted because I was no longer living in contradiction with my own heart." Friedrich's story became one of Jung's most powerful examples of love integration because it demonstrated that even deeply entrenched avoidance patterns can be transformed through conscious awareness, patient practice, and the willingness to choose vulnerability over safety. Friedrich and Maria's marriage lasted 43 years, ending only with Friedrich's death from natural causes. Maria described their relationship as a love that grew deeper with each passing year because we learned to stay present with each other through every season of joy and sorrow, fear and celebration. Jung believed that healing love avoidance patterns is essential for humanity's emotional evolution and the creation of healthier relationship models for future generations. The transformation from protective love to conscious love represents not just personal healing but collective advancement toward more mature forms of human connection. When individuals learn to love consciously rather than protectively, they create relationships that model authentic intimacy, emotional courage, and the integration of vulnerability with strength. These relationships become demonstrations that it's possible to love deeply without losing oneself, to be vulnerable without becoming victims, and to stay present with others' needs without being overwhelmed or depleted. Jung observed that children who witness parents staying present with each other despite love fears learn that relationships can be both safe and deeply connected. These children grow up with nervous systems that aren't threatened by intimacy, emotional expression, or the natural vulnerabilities that come with loving other people completely. This breaks generational cycles of emotional unavailability and intimacy avoidance that Jung believed were transmitted unconsciously through family systems. Children from love-avoidant households often develop either anxious attachment, desperately trying to earn consistent love, or avoidant attachment, protecting themselves from disappointment, perpetuating patterns that prevent authentic intimacy. Each couple that learns to love consciously rather than protectively creates a healing influence that extends far beyond their own relationship, Jung wrote. Their children learn that love means presence rather than performance, that vulnerability is strength rather than weakness, and that staying present with difficult emotions leads to deeper connection rather than overwhelming chaos. Jung emphasized that conscious love contributes to collective healing by demonstrating alternative models of relationship that prioritize growth over safety, authenticity over comfort, and mutual support over individual protection. As more individuals develop the capacity to love without unconscious withdrawal, communities become more emotionally intelligent and capable of addressing collective challenges through cooperation rather than defensive isolation. The workplace implications are profound. Leaders who have integrated their love avoidance patterns are more capable of staying present during conflicts, supporting team members through difficulties, and maintaining connection while addressing performance issues. They model emotional availability and vulnerability that encourages others to bring their full selves to collaborative efforts. Jung believed that many social problems stem from individuals' inability to stay present with others' needs, emotions, and vulnerabilities. Political polarization, community fragmentation, and social isolation often reflect collective love avoidance patterns writ large. Entire groups protecting themselves from the vulnerability required for genuine understanding and cooperation. A society composed of individuals who can love consciously would be capable of addressing its challenges through authentic connection rather than defensive positioning, Jung theorized. When people can stay present with others' pain without being overwhelmed, when they can maintain their individual identity while remaining genuinely concerned about others' welfare, collective problems become opportunities for deeper cooperation rather than sources of division. The environmental crisis, Jung might argue today, partly reflects humanity's inability to stay present with the consequences of our collective behavior. Just as love-avoidant individuals withdraw from their partner's emotional needs to protect themselves from overwhelm, societies often withdraw from environmental realities to protect themselves from the anxiety and responsibility that conscious engagement would require. Jung saw the development of conscious love capacity as essential for humanity's survival and evolution. We are facing challenges that require unprecedented cooperation, empathy, and the willingness to stay present with difficult realities rather than protecting ourselves through denial or withdrawal. The same psychological skills required for conscious love, vulnerability tolerance, presence under pressure, and the integration of fear with action are exactly what humanity needs to address its collective challenges. Religious and spiritual communities, Jung observed, often perpetuate love avoidance patterns by emphasizing service and compassion while discouraging the authentic emotional engagement that real love requires. True spirituality includes the courage to love specific individuals completely, with all the messiness and vulnerability that such love entails, rather than maintaining safe emotional distance while serving humanity in the abstract. Jung's vision of conscious love as a collective healing force suggests that every individual who learns to stay present despite love fear contributes to humanity's emotional evolution. Their relationships become laboratories for developing the emotional intelligence, vulnerability tolerance, and presence skills that the world desperately needs. The future of human civilization may depend on whether enough individuals can learn to love consciously rather than protectively, Jung concluded. Our survival challenges require unprecedented cooperation, which is only possible when people can stay present with each other through difficulty rather than withdrawing into protective isolation when connection becomes challenging or overwhelming. If you recognize yourself in the pattern of loving someone while simultaneously ignoring them, Jung would want you to know that this recognition itself represents the beginning of profound transformation. Your awareness of this contradiction isn't evidence of your failure as a loving person. It's evidence of your readiness to love more consciously and courageously than you ever thought possible. Jung discovered that the people we ignore most are often the ones whose opinion matters most, whose needs feel most important, and whose potential loss would be most devastating. Your withdrawal, distraction, or emotional unavailability likely represents how much you care rather than how little, with your unconscious trying to protect you from the vulnerability that comes with complete love. Your love avoidance isn't conscious cruelty, but unconscious protection that no longer serves your desire for authentic connection. The same psychological mechanism that once helped you survive childhood disappointments or early relationship wounds is now preventing you from experiencing the deep intimacy your heart actually craves. Begin by recognizing that your avoidance patterns are information about your capacity to love, not evidence of your inability to love. The fact that you withdraw from people who matter most reveals how much they matter, even if your behavior communicates the opposite message. Jung's work reveals that mature love requires the ongoing courage to stay present with someone even when loving them feels terrifying, when their needs trigger your fears, or when intimacy activates your ancient protective mechanisms. This doesn't mean eliminating fear, but learning to love despite fear, what Jung called courageous intimacy. You can learn to recognize when love-fear is being triggered, the subtle panic when someone looks at you with deep affection, the urge to check your phone when your partner shares something vulnerable, the mysterious irritation that arises when someone needs your emotional presence, or the sudden remembering of urgent tasks when intimacy becomes too real. These internal signals aren't commands you must obey. They're information you can use to make conscious choices. When you feel the familiar urge to withdraw, you can pause and ask, what am I afraid of right now? What would happen if I stayed present instead of protecting myself through distance? Practice staying engaged for just 30 seconds longer than feels comfortable. Share what you're experiencing internally. I'm feeling overwhelmed by how much you mean to me right now. My instinct is to withdraw, but I'm choosing to stay with you. Or I feel scared by your vulnerability, but that's about my fear, not about you being too much. Jung emphasized that transformation happens through small, consistent choices rather than dramatic behavioral overhauls. Each time you choose presence over protection, you're building your capacity for conscious love. Each moment you stay emotionally available despite anxiety, you're healing not just your current relationship, but potentially generations of inherited love-fear patterns. Remember that your partner's frustration with being ignored isn't an attack on your character. It's information about the impact of your protective behaviors. Their need for your emotional presence isn't evidence of their neediness, but recognition of your importance to them. The goal isn't to become perfectly present or eliminate your intimacy fears. The goal is to develop the courage to love someone completely, while acknowledging the ongoing terror that such love requires. Conscious love includes both people's vulnerabilities, fears, and commitment to choosing connection over protection despite the eternal risks of complete emotional exposure. You have the capacity to transform your love avoidance patterns into conscious intimacy skills. The same sensitivity that makes love feel overwhelming also makes you capable of extraordinary depth of connection when you learn to stay present despite fear. Jung believed that learning to love consciously is one of the most important contributions an individual can make to their own healing and to the healing of the world. Your willingness to face your love fears and choose vulnerability over safety creates ripple effects that extend far beyond your personal relationships. Every time you stay present when your instinct is to withdraw, you're demonstrating that it's possible to love deeply without losing yourself. Every moment you choose engagement over protection, you're modeling for others that authentic intimacy is possible, even for people who have learned to fear love's intensity. Your journey toward conscious love isn't just about improving your relationships. It's about contributing to humanity's collective evolution toward more mature, courageous, and authentic forms of connection. The people you love most are waiting for your presence, not your perfection. They need your authentic vulnerability, not your flawless performance of emotional availability. They want to love you completely, which requires your willingness to be loved completely despite the terror that such love inevitably triggers. Start today. Notice when you feel the urge to withdraw. Choose presence over protection, even if only for a moment longer than usual. Share your internal experience instead of acting it out through distance. Practice loving despite fear rather than waiting for fear to disappear before becoming fully available. Your love avoidance patterns develop to protect a wounded heart, but that heart is ready now for the kind of love it originally dreamed of. Complete, vulnerable, present, and courageously real. If you found Jung's insights about love avoidance patterns helpful, subscribe to join others who are choosing conscious love over protective distance. Share this video with someone you love but have been unconsciously ignoring. Your willingness to acknowledge these patterns might be exactly what your relationship needs to transform. In the comments below, share which of the 5 love-avoidant types you recognized in yourself. The phantom lover, the crisis creator, the intermittent reinforcer, the substitute focuser, or the future postponer. Your honest recognition can help others identify their own patterns. Next week, we'll explore Jung's most radical discovery about relationships, why the people who understand you best often seem to disappear from your life, and the unconscious pattern that drives away the very connections your soul most needs. The journey toward conscious love begins with a single moment of choosing presence over protection. That moment could be right now.